Okay, it sounds like what you're saying is that there are different levels, like the galactic level, the nation level, the interpersonal level, the financial level, then the cellular level, and then the atomic level, and so on. That have their own structure to them. That have their own laws. Maybe the laws are predictable, going one layer up to one layer up, but we don't even need to go down that route. We can just say they seem to operate on their own laws, and that's what you're calling a different dimension when you go from one to the next. Is that correct, or
yeah, you hit it right on, basically. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
That's
just
it.
wondering if
yeah, excellent.
Okay.
That was Curt Jaimungal explaining my own theory to me better than I could possibly say it. He's amazing. He's doing exactly what he does best. Welcome to the channel, guys. I'm Chris Lehto, retired F-16 pilot turned UFO investigator now. I was so happy to interface with Curt Jaimungal. He has basically had a successful YouTube channel called Theories of Everything. And he's focused, he talks actually in our discussion here, how he's gone into the UFO field as well, how he thinks it relates to consciousness. I found the same. I have my own theory of everything that actually is structure of the universe, how it's based into dimensions of life. I go through that actual theory. I relate it to Curt and get his take on it, and he does not disappoint. He fills in a key aspect for me, a really key point of my own theory. So I hope you guys enjoy it. I had to break this up into 2 parts. The interview was so long. So the first part of the interview, we go through basically entropy, theory, physics in general, down to basic assumptions, basic ideas of science. I hope you really enjoy it. I've really learned a ton learning from Curt. And then the second part, which will release next week, will basically be more into the emotional aspects of it on YouTubing, competition, dealing with stress. And again, I learned an amazing amount. Thanks so much to Curt for being on the show. And at the end, actually, he has a pitch for a video. He's actually helping young YouTubers, so YouTubers with less than 15,000 subscribers. He recommends 40 of them in a new video. Just a great guy, Curt Jaimungal. I'm so happy to have actually talked with him. I hope you guys enjoyed as much as I did. If you do like this content, smash that like button, man. It really helps the algorithm. And then subscribe for future videos. Okay, I don't always do interview videos. I hope you appreciate this one. And then if you want to support the channel, go to patreon.com. This video is actually a live stream only for patrons, so you can get behind the scenes access. Come to Patreon, support the channel at patreon.com/Chris Lehto. Now let's get to Curt Jaimungal. Chris Lehto, welcome to Lehto Files.
All right, welcome guys. This will be live for patrons. I have the famous Curt Jaimungal here from Theories of Everything, theoretical physicist and a filmmaker from Toronto. That's awesome.
Thanks for inviting me onto your prestigious platform, man. It's an honor.
No, thank you, man. Thanks for being here. I'm a huge fan. I try and catch a lot of your videos. And so, yeah, I appreciate everything you've done. And thanks for making the time. First time really talking to a theoretical physicist on the show. So I'm very interested.
Well, I don't publish, so technically I'm not a theoretical physicist, but I understand what you mean. And just so you know, I generally don't have much to say. I know almost nothing about any subject. So my resounding answer will be, I don't know, to most of your questions. And much of it will be relegated to little more than an expression of bafflement.
Yeah, and that works. I mean, yeah, you've done so many interviews, though, you know, you've talked to so many interesting people in this kind of higher stress environment, you know, under a lot more pressure. And so, yeah, I think it's just, I'm excited just to get your viewpoint. You know, what do you think? Because for me, this topic is just super difficult. And every day, it seems like I go through, it'll be like one day, like today, this morning, I watched Aerial Phenomena. Have you seen that movie, The Aerial Phenomena of Zimbabwe?
No, I keep being told that I need to watch it.
Yeah, same for me. So I finally made the time today. And yeah, I mean, it's amazingly compelling. You know, you have over 60 kids when they're young, give the same story, and then they get older. It's quite compelling. You know, so I have days like today where I'm like, it's obviously true, you know, and then, but then tomorrow it can go the other direction.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just such a difficult topic. So I'm excited to have you here and start discussing it.
Well, the same happens with almost any insight. So, for example, with psychedelics, if it's drastically far from your ordinary view, then initially you'll feel like this is it. This is the answer. I feel like I have it all. And then 2 weeks later, you're in complete doubt over what you experienced. And
Yeah,
it's not to say that you
deep,
shouldn't be.
I feel it too with these deep kind of quantum or physics models, you know, any kind of these deep concepts. It's like I can get there over a period of hours. You know, I can watch several videos or be studying a topic, and then I kind of understand it, right? Quantum mechanics is one of those, right? I'll get to some point where I can relate to some of your videos. You know, you made a recent video now where you go down and dial down into natural units, you know, kind of a physics lesson. I really enjoy, because you went right down to base assumptions, you know, and I find that in this topics, especially when it's so complex, I'll understand it for a little bit, but then a week later, it's gone. You know, I can't access that information again. It's so complex, you know.
Yeah, that's everyone. Don't even Ed Witten, even Terry Tao. I mentioned this in the video itself, which is that you need to understand, or you need to read on the topic repeatedly. You also need to use it. That's another aspect that is missing, because you need to manipulate the equations in order for you to have an understanding of them. But also, if you take a look at Terry Tao or Ed Witten's background, their background where they have their office, they have multiple books on the same subject. That's because you need to see the same phenomenon from different perspectives.
I think that's so key, right? What you said is to use it. It's like languages. You know, if you don't, you can study all you want a language, but unless you go out and use it out in like the real world where it's dirty, you know, or there's a lot of noise, you know, you're just it's never gonna sink in. You know, it's not training the neural network.
It also may be okay. There's this quote from Wheeler which says the point isn't to drink from the fire hose, but to get wet. So just think of what you're doing as getting wet, and sure, you may forget its explicit form, but you have an implicit form that later becomes easier to relearn the same type of material, and you can recognize intuitively different patterns. You may not understand why, but you can see there's a connection here and here, and that wouldn't have come about had you not initially learned, even though you've forgotten the explicit form. So don't beat yourself up too much.
Yeah, it's the basis, and that's why I've really enjoyed being a YouTuber. You know, is having that depth. You know, basically having the opportunity to talk to people like yourself. You know, that are so dedicated, obviously, to this. You know, focused on it, and then you're serious. You know, I really like that you seem serious on finding the truth. So I'll ask you a few questions. You know, just to kind of put you on the physics spot, I guess. Because I've seen you mention before, I don't remember the exact podcast I wrote it down, but basically you say that the particle wave duality of light, you know, if we're talking, you know, about the double slit experiments, etc. So quantum mechanics, particle wave duality of light. And you mentioned on one podcast, but you didn't go into it further, right? You're focused on the guest. But you said that there was basically a misunderstanding with the public, you know, that light can't be both at the same time. And I guess just want to get your take on, you know, I wanted to ask you to finish that thought, I guess. Why do you think, or first, do you think that the public has a misunderstanding? And then why do you think that is? How would you relate that?
Yeah, I saw that you emailed that, but I don't know what you're referring to. I don't remember saying that the public has a misunderstanding of it. Maybe what I said was that it's not a wave and a particle, it's a quantum mechanical object. And that to properly understand it, you should know some functional analysis or linear algebra, and you look at that, and then it's misleading to say it's a wave and a particle. It's better to think of it as, it's like saying, so you know what, do you know what R3 is, or R2? So the real numbers, and you cross the real numbers to get a plane. So like, look, you have an axis that's one copy of R, the real numbers, then you have another axis of the y-axis and the x-axis. So that's technically called R2.
Okay.
So R2 is not the same as R1. So R1 is just one line. So it's akin to saying oh wow, look at all these strange effects. Yeah, because you're thinking of it as just R1, but if you look at it from another perspective, if you understand what R2 is, then it's not so strange. There's also complex numbers where certain polynomials don't have roots in real numbers, but they do in complex numbers, and complex analysis is more quote unquote beautiful than real analysis. And it's because perhaps the better perspective is complex analysis when we're trying to view it from a real, quote unquote, real, not as in reality, but a real as in the
Non-complex.
mathematical. Yes. Then you get some strange phenomenon. Perhaps what I meant was it's best viewed as a quantum mechanical object, and then what that is something like I'll just be throwing out terms if I continue speaking, because it's difficult to explain, like a complex, separable, infinite dimensional Hilbert space. So then you need to know what that is. And so what's separable, what's infinite dimensional, what's a Hilbert space, what's an inner product, what's a Banach space. And all of these structures need to be explained in order to understand what a quantum mechanical object is. And then you also need to know the axioms of quantum mechanics in order to interpret what the heck that object is and how do you use it, what's an operator. So, sorry, what's an observable? And it's not explained. And so it becomes the target of any mystical notion that one wants to project onto it, because it's so unclear. It's aggrandized and it's spoken about without precision. I think that's what I meant. If I said it's misunderstood, I misspoke. I meant that it's aggrandized and it's spoken about without precision.
I see. And so what is your take then on like double slit experiment? What do you think is going on with the original double slit experiment showing, wave interference, but then when you supposedly measure it, so I guess the measurement problem is what I'm asking. So when you measure it, now you're affecting it into a particle, so where you can actually change the behavior. What is your take on the double slit experiments? The whole gamut of them.
Yeah, I'm not sure. There's different theories. So there's non-local hidden variables. That's Bohmian, in which case you have a particle and a wave. So that one, it would be correct to say, but it's not a particle wave duality. I don't know why that's a duality. Anyway, because duality has a specific meaning in physics and math. Okay, regardless, there's different interpretations of quantum mechanics. So there's Bohmian, which is called the pilot wave theory, I believe. There's also orchestrated objective reduction, which is Penrose's theory, which integrates consciousness and quantum mechanics. So it says that once there's a sufficient distance in some other space, I believe he used something called a quote unquote symplectic measure. But again, these are all just buzzwords. They mean nothing. They mean something. Trust me, they mean something, but they mean nothing currently because I'm not explaining what they mean. So there's some metric that you can define the distance between two wave functions. Once that's of a quote unquote sufficient distance, then it collapses. So that's orchestrated objective reduction. Then there's cubism, which I would like to explore. But the point is, you asked, so what's my interpretation of the measurement problem? I don't know. There may not be a problem. Sabine Hossenfelder sees that there's a problem. I don't see it necessarily as a problem, but I would like to catalog the different interpretations of quantum mechanics so that I can get a grasp of it.
Yeah, it seems like and you have the Mach interferometers. Yeah, it's very interesting. I went down a long rabbit hole of all those experiments, etc. But you mentioned you mentioned Penrose, but I was following Bernardo Kastrup for a while. I was watching a bunch of his analytic idealism and interview that he was on your show as well. Because you mentioned there about consciousness, maybe. And I did have one video based on experiments by Dean Radin, where basically they did an experiment at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, where it's the double slit experiment. And they have meditators, if you're not familiar with, they have meditators basically imagining which path the photon takes, right? And they have statistical analysis saying that this affected actually the instruments, right? This is the actual experiment, which, if true, is remarkable, I think. But basically, that goes back to what is your take on talking to Bernardo Kastrup, analytic idealism, consciousness as a base construct. What would that entail for physics in your mind?
For me, it doesn't entail much because physics is a branch of science, and science, in my interpretation, is agnostic when it comes to metaphysical claims. It's instrumental, and Bernardo also espouses this. He says that nothing about science will change from his interpretation. There's no need to throw out science. Maybe not, maybe it's incorrect to say nothing will change, but one doesn't need to throw out the project or enterprise of science, because science catalogs and says, if one measures this, or if one operates like this on a system, then here's what we're going to observe. And nothing about that changes. So it's not clear to me what aspect of science needs to be altered if consciousness is fundamental or not.
Yeah, I guess, my non-expert, view on it would be basically is the opposite of a materialism view. Basically our understanding, again, a paraphrase, is basically from Einstein, is that you have space-time essentially, right? And gravity essentially comes from the curvature, if you will, of space-time. Right, so it's basically like the physical effects come from the actual structure of the universe, or the nature of it, So I guess in my mind, if it was consciousness as the basis, then that would underlay space-time, So basically, if space-time is your basis of what we're seeing, everything we're seeing, it's kind of like you're looking for the wrong thing, I guess. Or if you're looking for consciousness, you would do different experiments to try and test.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So you're saying, look, it takes as an assumption something called space-time that seems to be mind, quote unquote, independent. Well, what if it was mind dependent? Then space-time derives from something that's like consciousness.
Yeah.
Sure. It's already being looked at. What is space-time fundamentally? So I'm sure you're aware.
Well, it goes down your natural units again. Your video you made on natural units really just, drilling down to really what is the base assumption that we kind of rely everything on. And I kind of feel like in physics, it's at this, Einstein has this general space-time paradigm, if you will. And I would think it'd be very difficult for anyone to say that they think Einstein could be incorrect on this. I think maybe it's like this hill that people, physicists just can't, they won't even mention it, because now they would have to say, just by proposing it, that Einstein is wrong. They would have to accept some level of hubris or
yeah, I hear that. I hear that mainly from Eric Weinstein, but I don't see that as being true at all. Many physicists have huge egos, and they want to disprove. If anything, they're compelled to say that Einstein is incorrect. And you see this from, I'm sure you get plenty of PDFs sent to you saying, oh, Chris, I understand how UAPs are formulated, or how they interact, or how they have a propulsion mechanism that isn't that's reactionless, and so on. And they say Einstein was wrong. People like to say Einstein was wrong. So I don't see that. And also, almost all of physics today is outside of what Einstein. So I don't see this as being true, that people are hesitant to say Einstein was wrong. I don't see that. I don't know where that's coming from. I know Eric Weinstein says that, but I just don't see that. And maybe he doesn't even say that. Maybe I'm incorrect.
I guess it's my own limit. If I go to say anything, especially not as like a scientist, I studied material science. I have a degree in basically chemistry, material science from 20 years ago. But if I go and say I can't say Einstein's wrong as a non-scientist. I can imagine if you're a scientist to say it. I don't know. It seems like it would just take a lot of gall to go and say it. I know I've been limited on my own channel to be labeled pseudoscience, which I'm sure already labeled, but to say that space-time is incorrect as kind of the basis of reality and consciousness is, I think it's a paradigm shifting concept. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Coming up on the Toad channel, perhaps by the time this is released, is an interview with a physicist named Ashtekar. So he's responsible for loop quantum gravity and loop quantum cosmology. He's also mentioned by Salvatore Pais. He's highly respected by Salvatore Pais. In fact, I think that Sal said, Curt, read Conversations on Quantum Gravity. It's a book that catalogs different interviews with physicists. Read all of them except Ashtekar's and save his for last. because he thought that it was the best interview on that compilation. Okay, Ashtekar said something interesting, which I love, I agree with. He said that and he's a spiritual person, which is rare to find a physicist or a mathematician who is. Actually, that may not be true, but it's rare to find someone who will publicly admit it. Ashtekar said, you'll find physicists, you'll find mathematicians who will say, look, Einstein was wrong. That's fine. But you will almost never find a spiritual person who will say Buddha was wrong. And that's what's different about science, is that you're willing to say that the heroes of the past were incorrect. But it's rare to find someone who will say, well, the person who said that the ego was an illusion is incorrect, or whatever it may be. People tend to just adopt it because it's been said by ancient people.
Yeah, I hope so. So do you think, like, with James Webb now, James Webb telescope came out, I'm sure you've seen all those amazing images, and you mentioned kind of their astronomy, however you mentioned it. What do you think? What is your take on James Webb? Is it going to allow us to peer through? Is there going to be a lot of changes in our theoretical physics?
I keep being told by someone who is interested in the TOE channel doing well that I need to cover the James Webb telescope because it gets plenty of views. I'm so uninterested in it. I don't see what the fascination is, but I haven't looked into it. So it looks to me, it's like an upgrade of the Hubble telescope. So it's just a more high resolution telescope. That's as far as I can tell. So great. We get interesting images of the galaxy. I'm not a cosmologist. I'm not interested in astronomy. I'm not like Brian Keating would be terribly interested in this. I couldn't care less. But also I have an aversion to whatever is talked about in the news. Generally speaking, I feel like that I like to go under the this is spiritual. And as perhaps this is something I'm trying to do, but I'm not. To go under the waves into the ocean where it's calmer. Because on the surface it's frothy and transient.
Yeah, definitely. So what do you what does interest you? What do you do in your free time? Are you studying UAPs all the time? Are you looking at cases or physics? You're reading theoretical physics? Cool.
Yes. And almost all my time, if I'm not spending it with my wife, then I'm studying, or I'm preparing for a podcast like this, or a video or another podcast, or it's just all studying or preparing.
Excellent. Yeah, I took your physics lesson on natural units. So I had a question on there. I sent you this on email as well. I noticed that speed and entropy were both dimensionless constants, which I remember thinking this in, growing up in university, is how is it that it has no units? We're talking about a dimensionless constant. Do you think anything of speed and entropy? And I'll go on a little bit further to talk about entropy. But speed and entropy, both dimensionless constants. Do you think there's anything to be taken from that about our universe or in general?
When it comes to speed, it's because the speed is then being referenced in relation to the speed of light, so it becomes dimensionless. That is, it's a speed of 0.5 is 0.5 the speed of light. Whereas when it comes to entropy, it makes much more sense that it's dimensionless, because it's you're counting. So in the same way that you're counting the number of cabinets here, it's just a number. Now also keep in mind that every physics quantity, everything that's measured is in fact dimensionless. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you say that you're, let's say, 1.7 meters high, that's your height. Okay, what's meant by that? It means if you go to Paris, there's some meter somewhere. It's not technically like this anymore, but it doesn't matter. That there's some quantity, there's some stick somewhere that if you take that and you stack it 1.7 times, you get your height. So it's still a ratio, which ratios are dimensionless. So everything in physics is dimensionless.
Oh, everything. Okay.
Everything in physics is technically dimensionless, even when it comes with the units, because the units are just, it's just telling you a ratio. So
it's a relationship. No, it makes sense. It's a relationship.
So if you say
So
something's 5 kilograms, then it means you've measured it such that the ratio between, it means that the ratio of the weight of what you have here, which is 5 kilograms, to the kilogram in Paris or wherever it is. I'm just saying Paris. It is technically the kilograms outside of Paris in a vault for whatever reason. It's 5 of those.
it's a ratio. Yeah, everything I guess is a ratio.
Well, try to think of something that's not. If you do, then like you can convince yourself, oh, actually, I'm speaking about a ratio. I'm speaking about a dimensionless constant or dimensionless quantity or ratio.
Yeah, it makes sense because it's also, I consider how the brain works is basically it has to start from some anchor point. Each thought actually has to start from somewhere is your base paradigm. And then it goes from there to somewhere else. That's basically interesting. But I guess back to entropy, I think of entropy and I relate it to my theory. Essentially, I have a theory of everything, right? I think everybody does these days. But for entropy is basically a ratio, kind of what you mentioned, of disorder. And I think of it in terms of chemistry. I know physics and chemistry define it. Entropy slightly differently. I guess the way I would define it is decreasing order. If you have a chemical reaction, entropy is going to describe which direction the reaction goes. Think of it as water flowing down gravity. Basically it's where your chemical process is going to go, because that is least entropy, right? It's kind of how we define all of our chemical reactions, at least in chemistry. So entropy is going to be, they say, times keeper, right? Another way to think of it is if you look at a video of the planets, right? If you imagine, you're just looking at the planets with their moons orbiting around the sun, right? Our solar system. And then you actually played that video backwards. No physical processes are actually broken, right? You couldn't tell, I guess, is the way to think about it. You couldn't physically tell if it's going forward or backwards in time. Whereas entropy, from my understanding, is the only really kind of thing, I guess, where it depends on time. If you break the glass, if I drop a glass off my table here and it shatters, now we play it backwards in time, you'll know. Right. And so I guess, so how I define that, and I use it for definition of life, is basically that life does that. It orders matter in its local surroundings into the future. So if you look back at civilization, you would be able to tell which direction it goes, I guess, and so that's kind of how I define life in my theory of everything. And it's kind of a specific theory of everything, that life, we can identify it by ordering matter. And so when von Leeuwenhoek, he was back in 1623, he's the Dutch guy, Dutch scientist back in the 1600s, Galileo made the telescope. So basically Galileo's trying to convince the kings, right, to look at the moons of Jupiter. Leeuwenhoek, actually, he used this proprietary technology he invented to make little lenses to look microscopic. So he basically discovered microscopic life back in the early 1600s, and he discovered bacteria and sperm cells. And I think, thinking back to that is, I think they would be surprised by the order that they saw, the little tiny machines, little biological machines working at that little level. Whereas we would expect to see just like dust, just dirt laying around, or, basically entropy gone wild, right? It's disordered, a disordered system. But when he looked down with the little microscope, he saw ordered systems. And so basically that would be the argument for life, is that it's at size dimensions. So we can physically see the dimensions, but it's size. So as we look down at microscopes, microbial life, essentially, we're seeing order. And then if we look up now, potentially at the James Webb images, right? You ask why are people enthralled by it? For me, I kind of am seeing at a different scale, like a vastly different scale, is like these little amoebas, you know, or there's some kind of order. There's like order going on out there at vastly different timescales, maybe from us in size. But maybe that could be life. You know, we're just surrounded by it. It's so obvious, or it's so ubiquitous, right? We don't expect it. So yeah, that's my whole theory of everything, is that we're actually in a system, in a living system. Because if you look down at your cells in your body, right, there's little cells that born and die into your body all the time. They have little jobs. They fulfill their functions. But when we look up to our level of life, we stop here, right? We're like, okay, human is the largest form of life on our planet. But then you look at companies, organizations, nations. You know, my argument is the nation is actually a real living organism on the earth. It's made up of neural cells. You know, humans are basically stem cells in a much larger organism. Yeah, so that is the whole essential theory of life there. It's ordered life. We can see the dimensions based on size, and that would imply some sort of frequency. You know, if size is based on frequency of motion, then you could say that maybe it's smaller dimensions. You know, you have higher energy, etc. Maybe these UAP events could be tuning into some sort of frequencies. Maybe they can change your size, right? Imagine you're like Ant-Man. You know, if you want to get to the other side of the universe, what if you can change your frequency to go super big, right? And then you go super small again, some other part of the universe, you know, some other galaxy. I don't know. That's crazy stuff. But the general theory is, I think you can see it clearly at our level. If you look, is just nations, right? Nations act like organisms. They breed, they they kill, they die, age, etc. So anyway, I'll stop talking at this point. That's my whole theory. Could it be possible, Curt?
Yeah.
Could it be possible?
Yeah. So when asking a question of is something possible, I would say generally the answer is yes. But unless one has a contradiction and they're using classical logic. But if what you're asking is it plausible, that depends on a number of factors, including prior assumptions and so on. So I think it would be preferable if you explain in a bit greater detail. So let me ask you a couple questions, if you don't mind.
Sure. Let's do it.
Okay. How is one defining order? Is it just you look and you have an intuitive notion of order, or using entropy to define order?
So it's entropy. So basically, one example is the gravity. The argument for dark matter, right? The argument for dark matter right now is that there's more mass, right? 75% mass or 77% more mass than we're expecting in galaxies. At the same point, you could be arguing that what we're seeing effects, right? We're seeing galaxies held together where we should expect them to be flying apart. So in that case, we're expecting disorder from all our math problems, right? All of our science shows us that these things should be flying off into space. The stars can't spin that quickly. So in that case, that would be order from what we're not expecting from our physical laws. So I define it with entropy.
Okay, let me think.
Yep.
Okay, so I don't know if you're aware, but this is something I like. This is something I've said quite a few times. It's not just me who says this, but entropy and order and disorder should be disembroiled. They're generally twined. They're generally intertwined. Sorry, when we're speaking, just you and I. But technically, if you take a look at a coffee, and then you pour milk into it and it looks turbulent initially, and you say, well, that's more disordered. Then you stir it and then it's uniform. Then you say, now it's ordered. Actually, that state where it's ordered has the highest entropy, whereas before with the turbulence, it had much lower entropy.
Yes, decreasing entropy. So life decreases entropy.
Okay.
Locally, right? Locally.
Yeah. Okay, but in that case there, was that life that decreased the entropy, or could that happen if it just sloshed around outside in a boat? Because then,
yeah.
Well,
Well, that's what we were expecting, right? I guess so. You're expecting when you mix so in your example, you're expecting you mix the coffee with the milk, right? You're expecting it all to mix. You know, the same as the galaxy, we're expecting the galaxy to spin just like we assume it will. But what happens is the coffee goes to one side and the milk goes to the other, you know, or the coffee, it ends up making little neuronal structures inside the milk. You know, basically that would be something we're not expecting. So and this is where physics and chemistry have reversed their entropy signs are reversed. Is from what I remember, looking at the different the ways physics identifies.
I know what you're saying. So there's something called free energy or Gibbs free energy, and that's minimized. So that's where they
have negative or
occur.
positive.
That's in
what I'm
chemistry.
saying is, you mix the milk with the coffee. So we're expecting, based on our law of, second law of thermodynamics, that it's going to mix. So in this case, life would basically be the bacteria on the top that creates some creates some scum or something, or creates some other structure in there that we're not expecting. So bacteria would be perfect, right? Because I mix coffee. I drink Nescafe, really terrible coffee because it's fast.
Oh, same with me. Oh,
You do?
I'm not a coffee snob at all, and I don't want to be. I don't know about you.
Yeah.
But it keeps me. I would lose all my money because it would all go to coffee.
Yeah.
The coffee is fairly expensive, so I
And
just
time.
stay with what's cheapest.
I do Nescafe, but I'll leave it around, and a day or two later, you come back, and there's actually something there on top. It's like, and it's life, right? It's living organisms, microscopic. I guess it's gross. I have coffee cups laying around with.
I understand. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, but that's the general idea.
Okay.
Is how I would define entropy and how life does it. So the point is, life would be different in everything else in that we're kind of like timekeepers, and we would be providing some sort of order to our local area, local universe. Maybe that's just what life does.
Okay. So here's some thoughts that occurred to me. So number one, earlier you said entropy depends on time. That's not entirely clear. In fact, many think it's the other way around, that time is a macroscopic phenomenon that occurs because of the second law, rather than the second law being dependent on time. Okay, so that's what occurs. And then
so what is it? Can you say that again? Sorry.
Yeah, that the arrow of time comes about because of the second law, rather than the second law being dependent on time. It's called the entropic arrow of time. Entropic as an entropy.
I see.
Carlo Rovelli, for example, is a proponent of that. And,
Cool.
and many others. I'm not necessarily, many people seem to have decided what time is. I think to me, it's still unclear, but I'm just telling you what some other people think. Also, so I guess my issue is only with using the word order and entropy. That's my only issue, is that I see this as a conflation that I don't think should occur, because it's well, I could go in, but I could talk about this for a while, but there's no point. It's known in physics that entropy and order don't necessarily correlate. So I can send you a video on that, and perhaps that means nothing to the theories. Perhaps it's just more poetic to say order, in which case that's fine. But to then give a concrete definition by tying it with entropy, well, then don't even use the word order, because if you're not saying anything new, just use the word entropy and stick with that. Or don't even use the word entropy and stick with order.
Yeah, exactly. I tried to make it as clean as possible, so just picked entropy decreasing. But I'm not sure if that's even the correct way to consider it, or if that's watertight by any means.
Yeah, here's something else that occurs to me. So free will seems to contradict with determinism. However, I don't know. Do you know what a finite probabilistic tree is? So it's a finite probabilistic tree is, imagine you have a graph, so you have some points. So I'm sorry. Let me let me think about how to explain. But okay, so if you have I'll just say the theorem and then I will try to explain it.
Cool.
So there's something called a finite probabilistic tree, and there's information loss on it. So if you have right here, imagine this is a node, and then my 5 fingers are yes. Okay, let's imagine I have 6 fingers. Each of them has a probability 1 6 1 6 1 6. This can be, you roll a die, then it can land on any one of these.
Cool.
But you can easily imagine that there's other distributions. So maybe it's a weighted die, and this one has 5/6 of the probability, and then the rest are distributed here. So this is a die that you use to cheat. Okay, so entropy is a way of taking a probability distribution and then assigning a single number to it. So you've taken a whole function, then you've given it one number. And it turns out that anytime you have a finite probabilistic tree, and anytime you have random data and you do deterministic processing of the random data, then you decrease entropy anytime that you do that. And so to me, if free will, which is associated with life, which is associated with non-determinism, it should mean that you increase entropy, but then it doesn't. So that's something well, the point of that was to say that you have life, and I imagine life doesn't work in a deterministic way. If it does, then it would be obvious to me why it decreases entropy, because like I said, deterministic processing of random data will decrease entropy. But then if there's an element of free will, well, then that goes against that. So that's just what occurs to me. There's not even a question there. I'm just telling you the thoughts that come to my mind.
That's cool.
I'll send you more information about that, because it's not as complicated as I'm saying verbally. It's easy when you look at it. You'll be, okay, I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is using entropy. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's key to the argument, but it doesn't necessarily mean it defines it, because the argument is that life organizes matter into new forms and replicates into the future. So however that can be
one more
defined,
question, if you don't mind. If you don't mind. I'm not trying to poke holes. I'm just telling you what occurs to me.
No,
my mind is generally the devil's advocate. So,
please.
Unfortunately. Well, anyway, what's meant when you say that there are different dimensions? So, are you saying that there's different scales, or is the word dimension meaning something here?
Yeah. So I guess you hear all these theories about string theories, multiverses, different dimensions. But I would relate it to, I think we can actually physically see other dimensions, and we use lenses as our breakthrough technology, really, to bend light, whatever this light stuff is that we're talking about, to actually bend it to peer into the other dimensions. So I guess the another dimension would be at your level, right? The person that is, you zoom down to imagine zooming down to one of your cells. It lives its little life, right? It's born into your body, right? Into it's trained in certain areas, right? So you have, systems of your cardiovascular system that's pumping around. You have your waste system, your energy, your neural networks of your brain. So if you zoom down to that level of that cell, right, I consider that another dimension of life that is you or me, essentially, right? But it's at such another order of magnitude smaller than we could possibly imagine. And I think the time also changes. The life cycle of your cells is very fast, So as you move up in size, if you imagine size would be our dimension of life. So that's how I would relate it as dimensions. So at this dimension, I'm still born and die into a system, right? As soon as you're born, you have a social security number. You have a family, you have a job, you need to go fulfill certain requirements in the community. So I think of that, if we can consider that as a possibility of another dimension of life, where we're actually inside of a larger living, actually breathing organism. If you think of any nation, I bring up Russia versus Ukraine. If you look at how the decision is made to actually invade Ukraine, I think it's an emotional one, like an animal, You know, we even talk about it. You know, Russia invaded Ukraine. You know, we mentioned Putin, right? But Putin not in that position. You don't care, right? It's specifically that man in that position, right, who was created from that country. So you even look at our decision making processes. You know, in our congresses, it's a neural network essentially. You know, the brains. If you look at our roads, how we dispose of waste. If you look at our defenses, the permeable membrane of our borders. Yeah, so I think in that case, really to think about Russia, Ukraine is this living organism thinks it's going to die, right? It thinks this Ukraine is being removed from it. So it's just like an emotional response, you know, and we see it. We can't understand, you know, how could nations do this? You know, I think they're like non-sentient organisms, you know, or yeah, so that's part of my UAP society is just to try and get those nations to realize that we're here, and it hurts. You know, when we get killed, tortured, like we can make lives better for everybody. So that's the general what I see, and then I try and put it down into a theory that I can relate or try and test. Right? The idea is, can we test for this stuff? You know, can you find statistical models for why nations? You know, is there a nation life cycle? You know, is there any validity to it, to the theory? You know, that's what I would like to test to be able to define it, and then actually try and test it as provable. You know, I don't proclaim that it's true. You know, I think it could be true.
Have you heard of group selection?
Is that like a herd theory for genetic evolution, or?
I don't know what herd theory is, so maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. What's group selection?
So group selection is saying, so Richard Dawkins would say that there's the selfish gene and that it's individual selection, so it's me against you, but then there's the group, which is that we're a part of, well, you're Portugal, so then you could think of it in terms of countries. So different countries, so groups of people are competing with other groups, and because of these dynamics, you have different selective pressures, and then that may play a part in terms of the human species against other species, or in terms of our planet against another planet potentially, or inside of our cells. So there seems to be cooperation here because, well, our bodies seem to be group selected at some level because our livers don't just replicate, or any cell in our body doesn't just replicate at the cost of the rest of the body. That's called cancer. That would destroy all of it. So it recognizes, when I say recognizes, obviously, maybe it's not sentient like you mentioned in the same way, but it recognizes in terms of behavior, it recognizes that it's a part of something larger, and so it plays its proper role. That's called group selection. It's controversial in evolutionary biology, but it's not obscene. It seems to me to be quite clear that there's at least some element of group selection. David Sloan Wilson is someone who is a proponent of this. Anyhow, the reason I mention this is that it sounds like what you're referring to is akin to group selection. And so when you say that there are different dimensions, to me, let me just say some other buzzwords. In physics, there's something called an effective theory. So an effective theory is, well, there's quantum mechanics, but then you don't predict how to build a cabinet from quantum mechanics. Instead, what you do is you say that quantum mechanics reduces to Newtonian mechanics, and then from that, actually that's even false. That's one path, and then you can take quantum mechanics to chemistry, and then to Newtonian mechanics, and then you can build, well, you don't even use Newtonian mechanics to build this, but essentially there are effective theories at which there are different layers of abstraction. So we go down as a reductionist and we say, okay, what's the most fundamental is what we zoom into microscopically, and we say that's what builds the rest of the layers that we see. But then there are these different layers that seem to have their own laws that are not, well, maybe they're predictable, but they're not readily predictable from a lower layer. So again, an example would be chemistry. You don't predict chemistry from string theory. You go string theory to quantum mechanics, even that's dubious. Who knows if that can be done, but you go string theory to quantum mechanics to then chemistry, and then you build up these emergent properties. Emergence is another word. So these are some buzzwords that people can look up. Effective theory, emergence. Okay, it sounds like what you're saying is that there are different levels, like the galactic level, the nation level, the interpersonal level, the financial level, then the cellular level, and then the atomic level, and so on. That have their own structure to them, that have their own laws. Maybe the laws are predictable going one layer up to one layer up, but we don't even need to go down that route. We can just say they seem to operate on their own laws, and that's what you're calling a different dimension when you go from one to the next. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, you hit it right on, basically. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
That's
Just wondering if we're
yeah, excellent.
Okay.
We'll stop it here, right where Curt basically just reads back my theory, understood everything, and added his own points. So amazing. We'll go further into that on part 2 of next week, so don't miss that. Curt relays some emotional things he went through, some issues. He's had some difficulties lately. He goes through that. We talk about that as well as being YouTubers in our own competition. Like you mentioned, there are several creators. Well, almost every creator who's quote unquote larger than you will never mention you. And it's because they want to squash you and they want to bring themselves up. So it's competition. And I was seeing that. Firstly, I see that in myself, but I also know that I wish Joe Rogan or Lex Friedman or someone higher than me, maybe not them, like they're way, way higher than me, but someone higher than me at least would once or twice mention me. That'd be great. And no one, I don't think there's a single person who has. And so I thought, you know what? There are some creators that I like that are in my space as in consciousness, math, physics, even UFOs and so on, that have a small subscriber count, like 15,000 or less. Why don't I just do a video highlighting them? Because that's what I wish someone did for me. So that's coming out tomorrow. It's a list of 40 channels that if you like the Theories of Everything channel, if you like math, physics, UFOs, consciousness, here are some channels that are from small up and coming creators that maybe you would like to subscribe to. So that video is coming out. And it should be out by now. I hope you enjoy that as well. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for supporting the channel. Smash that like button, subscribe for future content, and then go to patreon.com/Chris Lehto to support the channel. You can click the links in the description or on the cards. And finally, if you do want to get involved, we have UAP Society. Go to uapsociety.com. We've made the organization. We're out there trying to find, it's a crypto organization. Okay, we're basing it off Web3. We think Web3 is the way to go, so you can join us there as well. Have a great week. Peace.